We'll now take a few minutes to answer a question, but I was inspired also by the lecture. You seem to mention the shift that happened during Renaissance with modern revolution, because the ancient understanding of the human nature during the Middle Ages, that we used to be the summits of creation, and we've become the center of the universe. It's basically what you've explained. And you seem to suggest that there is a kind of new shift in the understanding of the human nature. And I was wondering if it is something that we are witnessing through movements, social phenomena like populism. Is there? Do you think that there is a new shift in this understanding of the human nature through the coming back of the institution of the family that is attacked nowadays?
Shall I answer now?
Yeah, if you want to answer, we will launch the questions, and then we'll take more questions.
I will answer briefly. I think that populism, for instance, or these kind of movements are as individualistic and communism and other movements of the last 300 years, because what we today call populism is not other thing than what Aristotle calls in politics demagogic. So demagogy is the same, no? And when the state grants in demagogy, every person is looking for its own good. Nobody is thinking in common good, nor the government, neither the individuals who benefits when that's policies. So I think it's the same matrix which take different forms. One can be more successful in one aspect than the other. One can be more successful in political terms. Other can be more successful in economic terms, but they respond to the same matrix, I think.
Thank you very much. I would like to see if there are questions in the audience. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the question would be more to Monsignor Piotr Mazurkiewicz. I would like to ask a question influenced a bit by the thought of Father Ernest Fortin, who was a lecturer at Boston College, and he devoted much of his time to political thought, natural rights, and natural law. And the question is it not that the biggest problem with the human rights doctrine and the Catholic teachings and classical tradition is that the fundamental difference between the two, or the three, is the anthropology presented by the Catholic and classical thought and the liberal tradition, which is behind the doctrine of human rights. So, because insofar as the classical and Christian thought presents some kind of a summum bonum in terms of social and political life, whether it is the rise in virtue or providing some kind of a social framework allowing for the pursuit of eternal salvation, the liberal tradition presents a kind of a no given end to a man. So the purpose of the individual is more of the pursuit of the self-interest, or the liberal democracy does not seek to define the goal of human existence or produce a specific type of human being. It rather provides a neutral framework for the person to find its own end. So the question is whether we are not facing a different anthropology behind the concept, and we're trying to some kind of connect it with our tradition, which has a completely different anthropology. And if so, then what is the exit from this possible trap of using terms which have a completely different connotation in terms of anthropology behind?
It was discussed that approach of John Paul II to liberalism, but I think that there was a change also in his approach to liberalism, his perception. I experienced this in my life, that when we lived in totalitarian regime, so it was clear that we want liberty, and this imagination was linked with liberalism, something which is opposite to communism. But when we started to construct our own project, it appeared that there was a mistake also in liberalism. And there was a famous interview with John Paul II by Jaś Gawroński, when the Pope was saying, yes, after the collapse of communism, it's not true that liberal society is the only alternative. And he said, not everything in communism was wrong. So that both systems are based on an anthropological error, which is different and is giving different results. And here my position is, on the one hand, that we can profit of liberal thinking, liberal institutions, but only when they are not a dominant philosophy, but auxiliary philosophy. So I refer to this distinction made by Kołakowski, who is saying perfect liberal society has in itself the seeds of self-destruction. So we have to support imperfect liberal state, so which is partially neutral in some areas. And we did this for decades before us as the West. When I think some of the elements of these errors were described, because, for example, that's the question of individualism. I think that symbolic is an expression of Thomas Hobbes, that people are born, are growing as mushrooms in the forest. So they have no parents, they have no relatives, they have no duties to each other. That's a totally wrong concept. But this wrong concept can provoke different results when we can say that Christian anthropology is prevailing, and when Christian anthropology is disappearing. So when I talk on this double-decker, you see, we liberals used to think that secularism is granting the condition in which religious people can take the opportunity of religious freedom. It's totally opposite. If I am right, and I dare to say this in the presence of Rabbi, if I am right, there is a Jewish story saying that before Yom Kippur, God is searching all over the world 36 right Jews. If he will find them, the world will exist for another year. If not, this is the last day. They are anonymous. But the meaning, as I understand, is that the life of all the people over the world depends on these anonymous people, who are saints. If these people will disappear, if we will miss those people, the others cannot survive. So I think this is the reality, that the source, the machine of social life is, we can say, sanctity, the grace. And due to this, the others can live in a human world. But without those saints, this world will cease to be human. But there is, that's philosophy, let's say, but there is also a political aspect. So criticizing the concept of some elements of doctrine of human rights, it's obvious that the Church, especially John Paul II, they referred to some human rights, just trying to defend concrete people, saying, for example, there's a right to life, there's a right to religious freedom. And politically today, we have no other language to communicate that certain values should be defended. So politically, we have to use the language of human rights, at least in some areas. But the main problem, political problem, is that if you will say the doctrine is a part of magisterium, so who is the main interpreter of the doctrine of human rights? Not the Church. It's the magisterium. The interpretive power is outside the Church. It means that there is someone outside the Church who has the right to interpret in what the Church should believe. And we should be conscious of this kind of trap. So if people are talking today that there is the right to abort, should this become a part of the magisterium? Because it's becoming a part of the doctrine of human rights. And when you read Pacem in Terris, for me this was a very important text, because all the texts on human rights were forbidden in the People's Republic. So the first text on human rights I got was the encyclical Pacem in Terris, which was published in Polish in Paris and illegally brought to Poland. And this text played an important role in my personal life. But on the other hand, this text, when I read, preparing my intervention, is strictly secular. This is not a religious text. God is not needed there, and is very optimistic. The Pope is saying that if people will be conscious of human rights, then they will be more spiritual and more religious. And people are more conscious today of human rights. Are they more spiritual and more religious? Are they more searching God today? And I think this optimism is groundless. But when I quote the Gaudium et Spes, we have to read the chapter till the end. And in Gaudium et Spes is said, if there will be an omission of God in the doctrine of human rights, it will lead to annihilation of human beings. That's in the Gaudium et Spes. I never heard anyone quoted this. But this is there.
Thank you very much, and you're also answering partly the question I asked after our first speaker, Professor Stawrowski, about the the rooting, is there, can there be a sound conception of human rights in a dechristianized society? So you've answered that. And we had a question by Gregor Popenk over there.
Yes, thank you very much for all those presentations, and thank you for quoting this sentence in Gaudium and Spes. It's quite important. I have just one, general question and remark, both together, regarding how human rights can be structurally opposed or incompatible with Catholic magisterium. Just two remarks on how human rights function. When you answer a question whether or not there is a human right or whether or not someone has a right to do something, by definition, structurally, human rights in practice, oppose always individual right to common goods. Because this is a mechanism of human rights. You know, whether I have the individual right to speak against, I would say, some things that could be a common good, like common decency or any other issue. So in the system of human rights, it's always the opposition between, on one hand, the individual, who has the right, a priori, and the common interests, like safety, health, and so on, right of the others, security, which are all common goods. So the limitations to the individual rights are the common interests, which are the common goods. Which means that in this system, the individual freedom is considered a priori as good, and the common interest or the common goods are considered a priori as suspicious or bad. It is for the state to justify that the common interests, the common goods, allow or permits to limit individual freedom. So there are two aspects. One is the systematic opposition between individual good and common good that is at the core of the system of human rights. Is it compatible with the Christian doctrine? Second question, is the fact that common interests are a priori negative, bad, because there are limitations to freedoms, is it also something that is compatible with the Christian doctrine? From my point of view, I suspect it is not.
So if one of you wants to answer, we just have 5 minutes left. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but we have 5 minutes left.
I'm sure that Pilar Zambrano would have answered better. Regarding the first question, I think that's the dichotomy I talk about, sort of, in a way. And between having to choose between common good and the resorts or movements that embrace common good, or we have to choose human rights and the movements or ideologies that supports human rights. As I said, I think it's a false dichotomy. I think it's a maze. So from a maze, how do you go out from a maze? From up, going up. So I think that we have to go up and recover the concept of justice. Why a person has the right to live? Because it's just. Why an unborn baby has the right to born? Because it's just. I mean, in the Christian or Catholic tradition, people has right to goods because it's just. And when you put it that way, there's no opposition between common good and human rights. It's justice, the criteria that may help us to distinguish what is right in what right is right or not. And about the freedom and the human rights, the second question, I think because we are all individualists in a way or another, because it's rooted in our culture, it's like consumism. We are all consumists in a way. So I think that there we tend to make a confusion, to get confused about liberalism and freedom. Nobody is talking here about freedom. Everyone, we are all concerned about liberalism, whether it's okay or not, is there a good liberalism or a bad liberalism. And I think that we have to recover the concept of freedom. And freedom is not human rights. Freedom is the possibility of flourishing and developing of the person in accordance with his community, because the person is not conceivable alone. So in accordance to the rest of the community where he is situated, he can flourish and develop. And this is what we call liberty, freedom. No? It's not freedom to do whatever I want. If I want to play in Real Madrid, I can't. So it's the freedom of man is situated. And this concept of freedom has very few to do with human rights, with liberalism. Has very few to do, because liberalism supposes that every person can do whatever he wants, which is counterfactual. Thank you for the questions, by the way.
All right, there would be much more to be said, but I think time is up. Would you like to take one more question? One quick question, please, because there is a coffee break now. I don't want
I'll be very quick.
Okay.
Regarding human rights, I think, and the magisterium of the church, that's an open question. Anyone can answer if Monsignor wants to answer, or if you want to answer. How do you see the change of the catechism of the church of death penalty? I mean, it seemed that, you know, what has changed seemed a contradiction to previous magisterium and previous teachings of grounded in doctors of the church like Thomas Aquinas, when Pope Francis issued his document saying that death penalty should be changed in the catechesis, and how then we look at the catechesis as a solid base regarding human rights if it can be changed.
You see, the change in the church teaching took place under John Paul II. But when we read carefully this chapter of the Catechism, is said that the old doctrine on death penalty is right. So the church is not changing the doctrine here, but the circumstances change. So probably in these circumstances, the death penalty is not necessary, and this way is immoral to use death penalty. But the Pope said not that those who supported the teaching on death penalty during 2000 years, that all those popes are criminals. That's not the position. When I'm reading the change installed by Pope Francis, this I understand only as an edge of emotions. So when I'm trying to understand the church teaching, I would refer to the previous version, but now there is more negative emotion in this teaching against the penalty than was in the time of John Paul II. That's my reading, but crucial is that for example, when we are regarding the system of the Council of Europe, and we have two additional protocols on death penalty, one in the time of peace and the second in the time of war. We can say that the church teaching is saying this, is supporting, or promoting even this annulment of the penalty in the time of peace, but it's not saying that they are that it cannot happen that in a certain moment the society will have to turn back.
Thank you very much. Okay, okay, real quick, and then we can finish the conversation during the coffee break. But you can answer very briefly. 1 minute.
Underlying the question of death penalty, I think, is the broader question of moral absolutes. No, so it is very difficult for Christian morality to explain how death penalty, legitimate defense, etc., are acceptable, and at the same time we affirm that there are certain moral absolutes, such as you should never choose to kill anyone. So as far as I understand, in the Catechism written by John Paul II, authored by him, he explained the death penalty is a kind of legitimate defense, and legitimate defense is not contained under the present "you should never kill." It is not the type of action, or legitimate defense cannot be typified as killing, the same as death penalty. Therefore, it is not an exception to a moral absolute. It is a case to which that moral absolute doesn't apply. All of which leads us to the discussion of how do we describe actions, but that is another topic. So I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention and presence. Let's have now a coffee break, and we'll see each other in a few minutes for the rest of the conference.